Let me take you inside the not-so-secret world of our congregation's worship committee just for a moment. I know you've all been wondering what kind of liturgical wizardry takes place there. If you have been around our congregation for a while, you know that we often work with an image during the season of Lent. And if you're paying attention this Lent, you're aware that there's a bunch of driftwood in our sanctuary. Well, when we got the idea to use driftwood from Lac Le Mans in worship this season, the worship committee all had the idea that this probably would take the shape of a cross at some point. But there was some talk about the second Sunday of Lent being a little bit early for all that. I mean, we are going to get to the cross, yes. Holy Week will come. But do we need to get there so soon? But there it is. A cross of sorts in the middle of our worship space this morning, because there it is, right in the middle of our reading from the Gospel of Mark. And you might be thinking, really? Are we at the cross already? Don't we have other things to talk about for a while? Can't we leave the cross until a little closer to Good Friday? And yes, that could very well be a question for us here on the second Sunday of Lent. Why the cross already? But it could just as well be a question for the Gospel of Mark itself. I mean, we are only in chapter 8, halfway through this book. Jesus isn't going to be forced to actually pick up his cross for another 7 chapters. So why do we need to be talking about it now? And even more, this could be a question for the whole Christian faith. Maybe you have felt this way sometimes. I mean, Jesus did all sorts of things with his life, teaching and welcoming and healing and feeding and blessing. Why do we have to keep coming back to the cross? This image that is so violent and painful and disturbing. Can't we focus a little bit more on how he threw really great parties sometimes? Or maybe just talk about the Winter Olympics? It's important to say right at the outset that the cross was not a comfortable symbol for Jesus' followers. In fact, it was a totally inexplicable one. Why would you want to keep remembering the way your leader was killed? Why would you want to keep recalling the absolute power of the Roman Empire? Keep recalling the way that it dealt with the criminals it considered the most threatening. A way that was deliberately humiliating and degrading, putting a person in this position of absolute vulnerability and disgrace. Why would you intentionally remember that symbol? Why wouldn't you smooth over it a bit? It's worth remembering that, because if we are sometimes uncomfortable with this symbol, if we sometimes want to gloss over it and move on to less gruesome things, just think of how Jesus' first followers must have felt about it. However much we may want to escape this disturbing symbol, they must have wished to do that even more. And yet they found that they could not escape it. They found the cross coming back again and again. As they reflected on all that Jesus did in the weeks and months and years that followed Easter, the cross quickly became more than just one event among many in Jesus' life, but an event that encapsulated something essential of who Jesus was and what his whole life was about. Something you cannot really talk about Jesus without. There's no part of the New Testament, not the Gospels or the letters or the visions, that is unconcerned with the cross. The various writers definitely do not see it in the same way. We're going to see that fact more clearly in the weeks that come in Lent. But they are all grasping at this event, all struggling to find the words and images to say something about what it means for Jesus, for us, and for the whole world. All of which brings us to today's reading, this halfway point in the Gospel of Mark, where the cross suddenly makes its first appearance. And what an appearance it is. In the passage that comes just before this reading, Peter stumbles very close to the truth of who Jesus is, naming him the Messiah for the first time. Rather than congratulate him or give him a theological diploma, however, Jesus immediately starts talking about his own death. And after the two friends rebuke one another in that heated exchange, "Get behind me, Satan," and all that, Jesus decides that it's not enough to talk about his own death. He draws anyone who might think about following him into this awkward conversation as well. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. It is either the single worst sales pitch in history, or maybe the most honest one. And it is so easy to mishear this passage. On the one hand, we can easily mishear this as being purely suggestive, like Jesus is just saying, it's not all going to be roses when you hang out with me. Like he's pointing out that there will be bumps in the road ahead. But anyone in Jesus' audience would have known that the language and the image that he uses here is much stronger than that. When Jesus was a young boy, there was a rebellion in Galilee, an uprising against Roman rule. And it ended, we're told, with thousands of crosses lining the roads in Galilee, each one holding the body of a person who dared to stand up to Rome. There was nothing figurative about crosses in Jesus' world. So nobody in Jesus' audience would hear, "Take up your cross and follow me," as meaning the road is going to be a little rough. It's much more serious than that. And on the other hand, we can hear Jesus' words as actually glorifying pain and suffering, as if our role is to go looking for crosses to bear to satisfy Jesus, or as if we're meant to simply endure anything that comes our way with some strange, holy resolve. But that doesn't really fit either, because Jesus doesn't say anything about going looking for suffering, and the only sort of losing one's life that he talks about here is the kind that comes from being faithful to the gospel, from seeking the kind of whole and just world that Jesus came to point to. He is encouraging no one to go on enduring abuse or injustice or senseless violence. So if he's not being purely figurative, he's also not telling people to go out and look for crosses to bear, well, what is he saying? To be honest, I think Jesus is just giving full disclosure. If you are serious about coming along with me, it's going to involve both of these things: losing your life and finding it anew. I think Jesus is talking about the deadly serious character of taking up company with him. But frankly, I think most of the pat ways we have of describing what that looks like don't do justice to what Jesus seems to be saying. I mean, we can say that we're meant to serve others and that we're meant to be loving and that we're meant to move beyond selfish ways of thinking, but take up your cross, lose your life. Those invitations encompass so much more than those pious-sounding things. They get right to the heart of who we are and who we might become. And what's more, those invitations are more than anything we can reasonably do. I really can't give you 3 simple suggestions for how you might go out and lose your life for Jesus this week. But what I can do is point to what Jesus says. Follow me. And you know what that means. Pay attention to what Jesus said. his words of pure grace, his strange and challenging wisdom, his teachings that turn our wisdom upside down. Spend time where Jesus spent it, in prayer, along with companions in faith, among people who need to hear a word of mercy. Find the company of the people Jesus found, people who are grieving, or at the end of their ropes, or left behind by the rest of the world, or sick to death of their prisons of loneliness or self-hatred. Keep seeking the things that Jesus sought, a world where every human life is treated as precious and sacred, where wholeness and healing flourish. Join in the struggles that Jesus joined, struggles for justice and mercy, for societies where no one is discounted or left out. And if you do that, even a little bit, even imperfectly, as we all will, if you do that, you find that a kind of death does come along with it. A death to that old self who knew everything and had all that it needed. A death to all those old, well-laid plans and attentions. A death to that old apathy and resignation to the world as it is. A death to one way of life, which is always painful. But on the other side, something new and previously unimaginable beginning to emerge. That is how I hear Jesus' invitation right now. I don't know anyone who can very well just decide to pick up a cross and follow. But I know that when we do follow Jesus, stumbling along in his footsteps, crosses do come as well. The call to let go of even our own lives, the things we cling to most tightly, and to put them in God's care. Martin Luther once said it this way: "I have held many things in my hands, and I have lost them all. But whatever I have placed in God's hands, that I still possess." It's a hard word, almost unbelievably hard, but it's also a word of great promise. During the next hymn, you are invited to come forward and pick up one of these crosses. Let this be a moment to consider what discipleship looks like in your life. Don't think of this as some heroic gesture, the moment when once and for all you are going to pick up your cross and follow. But do come, and let this simple action remind you of the losing of an old life that is always part of following Jesus, and even more, of the promise of finding a new one, and of being found in Jesus' company. Amen.